And then the truth. Nobody wants to be lied to. We all want the truth. Even if we can't handle the truth, we want the truth.
Mm-hmm. Hello, welcome back to All Good in the Brotherhood. My name is Brother Francisco, and joining me today is a very good friend and monk brother of mine, Father Barnabas O'Reilly. He's been in the monastery for like 9 years now, right?
I think so. It feels like one long day.
Okay. A good long day, or one that...
A good long day.
Okay, fair enough.
Mm-hmm.
He's been ordained a priest for just over 2 years now, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Which was really awesome, being at his ordination. I got to know Father Barnabas. He worked in campus ministry at St. Vincent, like I do now. So I've got to know him for quite a long time. So it was really special being able to be at his ordination, kind of see the whole kind of completion of his fatherly role, since he kind of stepped into that place in a way for so many of us. Now he is stationed at our priory in Savannah, Georgia, teaching high school philosophy, which I don't know a lot about teaching high school, but
it's kind of like babysitting. Whatever you imagine babysitting is, that's what high school teaching is. I say that facetiously, but sometimes it feels like that way.
I mean, it's an all boys school, right? That's your...
Oh, it's all boy. That's right. They say the craziest things, and it's fun though. Yeah.
And I remember, if you could share this story with us. Now, you already told it to me, but you observed a senior prank last year.
Oh, that's right.
Right? Yeah.
So my first year at the high school, I taught philosophy, but I also taught biology.
Mm-hmm.
And it was toward the end of the year, and I was trying to, prepare for classes, and it was like 9:30 at night, and I thought, man, well, I'll just go out and try to catch snakes. Mm-hmm. And I had like a cast net. I was going to go over to the back stream and just try to catch some fish and whatever. And I'm not in my habit. It's 9:30 at night. I'm going in the woods. I'm just in my civvies, and I'm just walking in the woods, and all of a sudden, I hear some footsteps also walking through the woods. And I hear this, high school boy's voice say, "Who's that?" And I was like, "It's Father Barnabas. Who's that? Like, this is where I live." And as soon as I said who I was, they all ran away. So I was like, I don't know what that was. So I just went and I was looking for critters and stuff. And on my way back, I was going back to the priory, which is right connected to the school. Mm-hmm. But I heard the boys around the front part of the school. And the responsible teacher in me was like, oh, I need to go see what this is. So I came around the school, and once again, I'm in my civvies.
Yeah.
And at first, the boys saw me, and they didn't register who I was. And then all of them, and they were all wearing masks to pretend like they were doing their prank, hardcore. And they saw me, and they all just started panicking, slowly walking away. And anyway, we had some good boys that came up, and they're like, "Hello, Father, how are you?" I'm like, "Good. You guys need to get out of here." So they all left, and I just saw kind of the prank that they were doing. They just messed some stuff up and whatever. And I thought, man, I should probably clean some of this up so that the people don't have to do it tomorrow. And then I just thought, man, what if I just counter prank these guys? Because they had all left. They didn't see that I was cleaning anything up. And I, for the next couple hours, cleaned every single ounce of everything up, so that when the boys came in the next day, all the seniors were just lined up in the middle of the school in shock that they didn't know at the time. But then I got the nickname Father Opposition, because I decided to ruin the prank.
Did that stick around for long?
Oh yeah, this whole past year, Father Op, because I had this one teacher. He was a vet at teaching, and I asked him for some basic advice. And he just looks at me, he's this good Southern guy. He goes, "Father, the boys are like water. They will find the path of least resistance if you allow them." Mm. And so anyway, they'll come in every day and be like, "Oh, we better not be doing anything in class today," I'm like, "Oh, we're doing something." And so it kind of becomes tongue in cheek. But the one thing I find with high school boys, and this is probably true for everybody, is that while they're not really motivated to do stuff, mm-hmm. they also don't really want to be bored. They just don't want whatever they're going to do to be lame or pointless. which I identify with a lot. So anyway, it's fun.
So at the school you teach philosophy, right? To
Yes.
juniors.
Yes.
So when we were talking about this, you mentioned that a lot of like your instruction with them is focusing on the need to teach principles, because, and especially for your like demographic of high school boys, they tend to be like conservative Christian men, and then when they're though in the world and they have to counter something, they know why that something is wrong, but they don't necessarily know why or how to defend it.
Right.
So like a lot of your work with them is to kind of give them philosophical principles to defend. What are some principles you start with? How do you go about that? And why do you think that that's like the starting premise we have to begin with at all?
Yeah, well, I mean, as you're saying, one thing that comes up that I teach the boys is that what's called ad hominems are not sufficient for good argumentation. And, ad hominems being Latin for like against the man, where rather than attacking the argument, you just attack the person and be like, you're dumb or whatever. And so this is basically my goal in the class with the boys. And so more or less what I've, in my first year, when you study philosophy in the seminary, it just is something you have to do. Mm-hmm. And I'm just like, drinking all this philosophy like from a fire hose. But then once I actually had to teach it, I started to parse out like, okay, well, what part of this do I offer to them, mm-hmm. and how to distill it down. And so kind of the way that I do it is the first semester is, like you said, it's all just basic principles about, the parts of philosophy that I decided to teach them. And then the second semester is mostly like trying to talk about controversial things in society and all the buzz topic things that are out there, but always keeping in mind the principles that we learn. Mm-hmm. So for instance, the way I always start my course is making sure that the boys have memorized, and this is probably the only thing they actually remember from the class because it's day one, is what does the term philosophy mean? Most fields or whatever, like theology is like the study of God, right, yeah. Biology, the study of life, philosophy, the study of, well, no, actually it doesn't have that ology, right? It's philosophia, mm-hmm. So the love of wisdom. So I tell the boys, I'm like, listen, I'm not interested entirely just in your, memorizing stuff, even though I make them memorize a lot of stuff, but I'm actually interested in you growing in wisdom. And I've seen it happen with some of them where they start to, I don't know, often I think it, just like a good homily can do, I think people just don't hear the truth, mm-hmm. At least maybe presented in a attractive way. But when you hear the truth presented in an attractive way, it's almost like, yes, like I've been waiting for someone to say this or kind of present this way. Mm-hmm. Which really, that becomes the start of my course then, is talking about, well, let's talk about truth. Because if we can't get the same terms, then we can't talk about anything. Right. And so I give the boys the distinction between what we call objective truth and subjective truth. So my great experiment that I always do, and the day that this fails on me, I'm going to get fired and it won't be good, is I say, all right, boys, is there any such thing as truth like that everyone can agree on? And often, even in the conservative South, you'll still get, well, there's, whatever you think is true, that's true for you. Right, yeah. I'm like, okay, well, I do an experiment where I have them take a pencil. And I say, all right, grab your, and I'll pick like kind of the most difficult kid in class, be like, you pick up a pencil. So he picks it up, or usually the difficult kid doesn't have a pencil, he has to borrow a pencil. And I say, flip it around. He's like, okay. So the pointy end is right toward your face. Yep. And I say, on the count of 3, we're all going to count. I want you to shove that in your eye as hard as you can. And usually the look is like, oh. I'm like, 1, 2. And then, of course, to this day, no one's done it. And whenever I ask them, I say, why didn't you do that? The answer is usually something like, well, that's dumb. And I say, well, who taught you that that's dumb? Yeah. And they're like, no one. I said, well, how do you know that? And then I open up there, teaching them a principle that for me is kind of the foundation of the whole endeavor of philosophy, which I think is especially helpful in the Catholic world, which is natural law, mm-hmm. right? So I think that natural law is so helpful in understanding not just our issues today, but also understanding the human heart. So I'll kind of be quiet there.
Yeah. So by natural law, you're referring to just because we've talked about these things, but sometimes, like especially for high school boys, like saying things directly can be very helpful. So like, the natural law being that which is like, I mean, Aquinas would say like readily apparent to us without like a bunch of syllogisms, coming to like a rational conclusion. It's like ever present to us. The law of God himself written upon our hearts that we participate in is natural law, right?
Right. And so what I do with the boys is I focus on natural law, but I put it in the context of the other kinds of law that Aquinas talks about. Yep. So the first one would be eternal law. And they're like, what's eternal law? And eternal law, Aquinas says, is the law that exists in the mind of God, right? And I'm not just talking about like the Christian God. In philosophy, we're just talking about like the transcendent God. We'll get to the Christian understanding of God later on, boys, or like slowly. So an example of eternal law would be, a great example is gravity. Gravity is an example of eternal law. It's almost like the rules of the game that we've inherited, that we can't change the rules, right? Yeah. Or we can try to change the rules, but there's consequences.
Right. Yeah.
And so science, of course, has, we're discovering the rules of eternal law, gravity and things like this. But Aquinas says that natural law is the unique participation of rational man in eternal law. So what does that mean? Well, he gives, and I test my boys on this like every single day. He gives 5 like natural inclinations that in order for us to really be happy, we have to abide by these things. In the same way that in order for us to be happy, we have to not jump off a building and fall.
Right. Yeah.
And so my little pencil example that I do is the first principle of natural law, self-preservation.
Preservation of life. Right.
Which is like, no one in the history of the whole world, I don't care what religion, tribe, background you've been from, no one has to explain to you that you shouldn't harm yourself, right? If, as Aquinas says, you're rational, which means like you have like all your capacities, which we can talk about in a little bit. But so self-preservation, I shouldn't harm myself, which means, guess what? I shouldn't harm other innocent people. And when they talk, they're always trying to be like, well, what about like in war? And I'm like, well, we can talk about just war theory later. Yeah. Remember the practicalities next time. Let's get the principles down.
Yep.
The second one, the second principle is sexual union, right? So I don't have to explain to the boys like, why a beautiful girl walking down the hallway is beautiful. They're just like, there's an instinct there. Yeah. But that even also, and we get into that as time goes on, also has kind of implications to that, right? That there's certain things, like we talk about marriage, and I have them write a little paper on marriage. There's certain goods of marriage that if you violate that, like if you tell your wife, like, hey, I would love to get married to you for 6 months, right? Well, that just doesn't make any sense because the nature of marriage within sexual union is lifelong, and we get into all these things. And then the last 3 are pursuing the good, which is really the first of all of them, that everyone who's ever lived wants what is good. We only choose the bad when we perceive it as a potential good.
Right.
And then the truth, nobody wants to be lied to. We all want the truth. Even if we can't handle the truth, we want the truth. And then the last one is living in society, that even the most hardened kind of like isolating person, they can go away from friendship, but they can't get rid of their desire for friends. And so with those, I basically just conduct the whole course. Because why? Well, if you look at, like, for instance, all the 10 commandments, which is usually like, we're like, okay, like I just don't have to do the bad things and I'll go to heaven. Well, I show the boys, and I love showing people that if you look at each of the 10 commandments, like the negative precepts, thou shalt not this, thou shalt not that. Well, why did God choose those 10? And you can line each of those up with one of, if not more, of those 5 inclinations of natural law, which is like, why shouldn't I steal? Well, guess what? It violates the truth and living in society, right? Why shouldn't I violate, do adultery or other things in that, sexual sins? Well, it violates sexual union, also living in society. Why shouldn't I violate honor your parents? Well, I always say like, well, self-preservation, they might hurt you. But also like living in society and the good. So all of them make sense. And like, oh, all of a sudden Christianity goes from, well, these are just the things that I can't do, to like, oh no, these are ways for a father to tell his little children, listen, I want you to be happy.
Yeah.
And in order for you to be happy, this isn't like a subjective matter. Like, for instance, you might like basketball and I might like soccer, and the boys argue about their sports all the time. That's fine. There are subjective truths,
Sure.
like your favorite sport versus my favorite sport. But then there's also a classification of truth that is objective, that we're all looking for. And if we like deviate from that, well, it's not just a sin, it also makes us sad. So this is kind of how I open the whole course for the boys.
I like that. And, I remember studying the Ten Commandments and how, because those things are also apparent to us by the natural law, God didn't have to necessarily give the commandments to us, but he gave them as a way to add on to our desire to do them, I suppose. That he revealed what would be natural for us to come to by reason, in order to have a deeper relationship with us through them. So what could be revealed to us naturally, he also revealed to us divinely. Which is
another, among the laws, right? So I said there's eternal law, which is like the mind of God that we participate in, which is natural law. Well, then there's also divine law, which is that law that's revealed, like the Ten Commandments, that, like you said, we could know it, but there's parts of divine law that only can be known from Revelation, which is it. All of them should fit together, though, right? And then the last one, eventually we get to, is human law. So human law being like, for instance, I just got pulled over last week by the police, announcing it first here on this podcast, because I went through a stop sign that it was in my home neighborhood. I was visiting my parents, and I just went through the stop. And you might say, well, why'd you go through the stop sign? Well, it was dark at night, and it was a new stop sign in my neighborhood that all growing up wasn't
Never
there.
was there. Yeah,
and so I was like, who put this stop sign
here?
here?
Pilot mode. Yeah.
And yet, I could argue, so it's like human law that decided to put it there.
Yep.
And Aquinas says, though, that any good human law should match up with the natural law. If it violates it, then it's an unjust law. And I could argue well, this is a stupid place. But really, the point of a stop sign is what? For self-preservation.
Yeah. Yep.
So it fits the bill. And that's where, we can talk about in politics or in law, well, what's the best way to have these certain things? Certain things have subtleties where we can, dial in, what's the best speed limit for this? But then there's other things that I teach the boys are just inherently, good or evil that we can't, there's no wiggle room on this,
Did you get a ticket?
No, I got a warning. I got a warning, which is a very nice cop. Thank you, officer.
So out of those principles, do you find in your discussions with the students that there's one that is more difficult for them to get behind, or that they challenge more, or that in your application of real world problems tends to be the one that's under attack the most or questioned the most?
Yeah. Well, each of our topics within society now kind of have little, each one has its own obvious, yeah, I would never, I believe that versus I wouldn't do that. So for instance, self-preservation, we'll talk about things like war, just war theory.
Yeah.
But maybe more relevant is, talking about abortion and, I find that a common thought in people's brains is well, I believe it's wrong, but what about this unique kind of situation? And, I'll just walk through, and I've really just not being confrontational, but just walking rationally through things with the boys. I've had many of them just be oh yeah, that makes sense, But, when we just simply go from our affect of well, what about this situation, that situation? There's always, well, what about the other side of the feelings here? So I feel that's a big conversation that we have. In sexual union, we really talk about marriage quite a bit and what that means. Especially, I'll bring in the question when it relates to the truth. I'll say, boys, is it ever okay to lie? Oh, and this one gets them going a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Or I'll put another way, like, is it ever okay to cheat? Because at my school, they have to take an honor code. Each boy has to, like, say it in front of the administration and then sign something where he says, I will not lie, cheat, or steal or tolerate anyone who does, right? Which is a great kind of just simple, like, hey, I'm going to abide by natural law and be virtuous here. And so the boys always make a distinction, like, well, do you mean like cheat on homework or like on your, significant other? Because those are different, So we have conversations like that. But I feel like we spend a lot of time talking about, well, what's not okay, and the boys will ask, what's not okay here. But then the big conversation that we really try to always come back to as well is not just the negative precepts of, well, how do you not violate things like the Ten Commandments and natural law, but Aquinas talks about the positive precepts. So how do you live those 5 inclinations more fully? So that you're not just living in fear of, like, well, how do I not mess this up?
Right.
But he would say, how do you be virtuous? So how do you be, not just preserve your own life, but make it the best that you can and help preserve other people's lives? How do you not just, like, not fall into sexual sin, but how do you have, like, a full, rich kind of, like, relationship? And same thing with the truth and the good and living in society. And so that always becomes like a kind of a call to arms of, like, living virtuously. And I always love to tell the boys that the word virtue comes from the Latin word vir, which means man. So whenever I give them a quiz or a test, I'll ask them, like, what's the definition of virtue? And I'll accept one of 2 definitions. I'll either accept the definition Aquinas gives, which is the means between excess and defect, or they can just write down manliness, and I'll take it, just because, like, it makes me smile.
Awesome. I love it. You also mentioned that.
Well, sorry, there's like 2 things I'm thinking about right now. So first, just to comment, I really have appreciated a reframing of whether it's virtue or like you're talking about principles and in living well, right? Is kind of reframing of these things as not freedom just from something, but freedom for something. So that living well by these principles is not, okay, it's freedom from, like, all of these fun things you could be doing, or like these good times you could be having, and you just have to do this because God told you. It's like, no, it's actually freedom for having fulfillment and proper ordered life in a way that it is truly happiness.
Well, and so that's the word that I quiz them with as well, right? So Aristotle calls this kind of happiness that man is looking for, I think the word's eudaimonia, right? Which is, or I'm sure it's, a better translation, or a better pronunciation, but it's the type of happiness that is not just, happenstance, but whenever we're living as fully as we should and can. And I think we can add to that the Christian level, that there's always going to be desires in our hearts of wanting to find and reach that place. But that's where I'll pivot from simply just natural law. I always go back to that, but we'll talk about God philosophically and talk about, the proof for the existence of God and things like this. And then one thing I love to teach the boys, and I love to preach about often, is when Aquinas talks about, like, so man's end, everything has an end. He calls this teleology. So for instance, the chair, I'll get a chair in the classroom and I'll jump up and stand on it, and the boys are like, what are you doing? And I'll say, is it okay if I stand on this chair? They're like, yes. I'm like, is it okay if I prop the door open with the chair? Yes. How about if I put a pot on the chair for a flower, thing? Whatever. Yes. I said, does the chair fulfill its purpose of why it was made if it does these things? And they say, no. I said, well, how does it fulfill its purpose? Well, if someone sits in it. I said, well, how do you know that? Well, because, this is a good philosophical question, right? I said, well, we can just go to the guy that made the chair and ask him, or you can look at it, right, and its kind of structure function, which I like to say biologically. Structure function. Or we can look at its form and matter, or even ask these questions that Aristotle has of, if you want to know what a thing is, you can ask 4 questions, right? So the first one he says is, what's it made of? Be like, well, it's made of, like, plastic and metal. Okay, interesting. We don't know what it's for yet. The second question is, well, what's its form? Now that's a hard question until I tell the boys, like, close your eyes and think of a chair. And there's certain things, there's a lot of flexibility of what a chair looks like, but there's certain things that it's obviously not. Like there's no such thing as a chair without some type of seat. That wouldn't make any sense. It might have like multiple legs or a different back. There's weird chairs, but a chair without a seat wouldn't make any sense.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, it wouldn't be a chair. Same thing like an American flag without stripes and the stars. I know there's different versions of that too, but American flag has a certain form to it that everyone knows in their mind. And then you say, okay. And then there's the efficient cause, such as who or what made it.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the last one, which is the final cause. And anyway, I get to this because I say, well, this is all fine and dandy, but they're like, why are we talking about chairs and American flags? So what is man's final cause? Like, what is our end or purpose?
Mm-hmm.
And that has a lot to do with God. But as Aquinas says, and I'll just kind of fast forward this, as he says that God is man's final end, and that the beatific vision, right, is the fulfillment of that Aristotelian like desire for happiness, that we have four traditional substitutes that get in the way, right? The four traditional substitutes. And even at the high school level, they kind of like, this kind of clicks in. And it's hard with high school kids because they'll like listen, but they won't respond. So I just kind of like have a dialogue with myself. I'm like, oh, Father Barnabas, thanks for saying that. But Aquinas says that, of course, instead of God fulfilling our happiness, we'll seek first wealth. Like, all the boys know this, like, oh, I just need to get a job that makes a bunch of money.
Yep.
I tell the boys, I'm like, listen, I've met a lot of people that get a bunch of money. It's usually not enough. So then you seek the second one, which Aquinas says, which is pleasure. So like, now I have all the money, I can buy all the pleasures of the world, go on all the vacations, it'll be great. Well, that's not enough. So then I move on from there to, power.
Yep.
I want to be the CEO of everybody and everything and just be like in charge. But the thing is, he says that's not enough because no one wants to be like a tyrant and be hated. So we want to be in charge and have all the power, but also be considered well. And that becomes an idol too of prestige. That's the last one. And I tell the boys that those four of prestige, power, wealth, and pleasure, none of them are inherently bad. They're all like fine and good until we let them become God. Then they become bad.
Yeah,
Exactly.
sure.
So anyway, the boys seemingly, kind of like this and apply it, but I give them little assignments and have them memorize lists and all the rest. So.
And I've definitely, so like in our case, religious life, the temptations, even though we're pursuing God, right? Those are always well and apparent right in front of us too as temptations, and I was like reflecting on this too. That like, okay, like the wealth is kind of just been taken out of our hands. I mean, I guess there are ways in which you could amass wealth of your own, hide it from the abbot, whatever. There's a lot of dishonesty there, I suppose, but that card is kind of taken out. And sure, we've seen lots of impropriety with priests where they're pursuing pleasure or some aspects there. But I think the two that are more tempting for us, I still see, is the power and the prestige. Power in the church, and then in prestige or popularity in some aspect of the church. It's like, I want to be, the Catholic celebrity, or I want to be that priest like Father Mike Schmitz that everyone knows, or like if I was the bishop, these things would change and people would listen to me, and so that no matter what your life is right now, where you are, who you are, those are always going to present themselves as things to put yourself.
Well, if you think about
in the place
those,
of God.
yeah, if you think about what you just said there too, it kind of matches. I always loved Bishop Robert Barron's explanation of Dante's Mount Purgatory or whatever. When Dante, he says or claims that it's the higher levels, the more like fleshy temptations of sin, of lust and gluttony and greed that are like more easily overcome than it is the deeper spiritual ones. Like those are actually more difficult to overcome, of pride and envy, right? And in terms of prestige and power, they become. It's like you've already amassed all the material temptations, but then it just becomes like more difficult to see, and it's hard because, so to just pull this into like something very, very practical, because I'll teach this to the boys too. Because I think overall philosophy is helpful just to understand human nature.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the church, above any other organization or institution or whatever in the world, should be the place that people should be able to look and seek understanding human nature. And there's so many podcasts out there now, I think, that have just exploded in our times, because we kind of now have time to step back from too much busy just work and survival to maybe do things like have the luxury to ask questions about, well, how do I improve or get better in this, that, and the next thing?
Yeah.
And I think the church really needs to be able to say, listen, we have a great tradition for this through our philosophical tradition and elsewhere. And this includes really, I think, certain areas of psychology as well. Like in the seminary, we learned about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which I love to like teach the boys. One, because I use it half the time to interact with them. Whenever, working with college kids, it's a lot easier to just be like, hey, what's going on? And then we can have a dialogue. With high school boys, I'll just get like a kid in the hallway all angry, being like, I hate everything in this school. And I'm like, okay, like here, come over here. And we just like start walking. And we'll walk, right? And I tell the boys what I'm doing in class. I'm like, listen, why is it easier for you to sit down or for you to walk with me and talk about things than just like sit face to face as dudes? And I'll teach them about how Aristotle had the peripatetic way, where he would walk side by side and like teach. I said, who else walked with his disciples and taught things? Anyway, I'll go for a walk with the boy who, if he's having a hard time, and I'll just ask him like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So the first layer is like, hey, what's going on? I don't know. I'm just angry. Like, well, what time did you go to bed last night?
Yeah.
Have you eaten anything or drinking anything other than Mountain Dew? Because Maslow says the first layer of need that we have is like basic needs, like sleep and food. And unfortunately, people, especially high school students, don't really know how to take care of themselves. And so if they're like, I went to bed at like 4 a.m. and I played video games all night. I'm like, okay, why don't we have this conversation tomorrow after you go to bed early and drink some water? But if they say, I did that, I'm like, okay, well, let me move up to the next layer, which is safety and security. And so that's more or less like, well, one, do you like feel safe? Not just, in your environment, but, in your home or in the school. Are you experiencing like anything that just makes you feel on edge, giving you the fight or flight? But then if that's okay, I move up to kind of the one where I get the all the stars and bells go off, which is a sense of belonging. Maslow talks about that we desire belonging. And that's usually where most people, the conversation starts to happen. And then, from there, it's helpful for me, even in class, to explain this, and maybe I'll leave this as kind of like a last thing, but I think, especially when you're young, trying to figure out, well, who and what are my friends? And how is friendship and belonging supposed to happen? Because there's so much drama of like, we're friends, and then it's weird, and then we're friends, and now with social media and texting, like everything just becomes like too complicated. And I think one way is to just understand like, well, where's this friendship at that you're in? And so I teach them in my class that Aristotle has 3 forms of friendship.
Right, yeah.
There's like the basic, just weakest level that he says. It's not bad, but it's the weakest, which is the friendship of utility. So these are, for the boys, I'd be like, these are like, the guys on your team. They're just your teammates. They're kind of your friends, but once the season's over, you don't really hang out. It's not like you're against each other. Your bond is just on like, we're teammates. We help each other win the game.
They're there for a particular purpose. And that's
exactly. So we have, I'm sure your listeners have many friends like this, coworkers or, people at church that was kind of like, we did the project together, and that's fine. But our hearts actually want something more. So the next level down would be, as Aristotle says, friendship of pleasure. And he doesn't mean by this just like inappropriate pleasures, but just like imagine a kid goes from having a teammate to like, hey, you want to come over to my house and like play video games, and we're having like, pizza. It's like, oh yeah, like we relate on just having fun together and laughing. Video games,
someone
pizza.
Smoke and joke with.
Exactly, which is once again great, and it's like more a deeper friendship because you're taking time to spend with them. But unfortunately, he says that's also pretty weak, because as soon as the pizza party's over, or the the little hangout session, then it's kind of done.
Your foundation, what you've built it on,
right,
isn't really solid.
And, high school kids, they usually get there like, yeah, that's like the goal. It's just like, as long as I'm invited to like the party or the thing, we're good. And I tell them, I'm like, well, hopefully by the time you get to college, you'll experience the last one, which is, he says, the deepest form of friendship is friendship of the good, or friendship of virtue, which really means like you have a friend that cares about you as much of, if not even more than themselves. And that type of friendship is not like easily broken, if at all. Even if, you separate and you move to different towns, like it's always still there and you can rely on that. And that's the type of friend that really you can just share your heart and they, theirs. And this is what we're looking for. But of course, I think it's quoted that Aristotle said, if a man has like 3 of these in his life, he's blessed. If he has 4, he's a liar, just because it's hard to have these.
They're so rare.
But I bring these up because it's not like I'm telling people to classify people in boxes. But sometimes it helps at least with expectations to be like, yeah, like that person, like I don't need to be like this friendship of the good. Like they're just not, they can't offer that to me. But I'm happy to like, play sports with them or play video games or whatever. The problem is I still need friendship of the good. And I offer to the boys, like, guess where the best place is to find that? In the church, right? Come to the campus ministry thing. Like come to the thing that we're doing to talk about God and virtue, because I've seen different people that have nothing in common whatsoever in terms of like, what sports or what interests or whatever that they have, but they have this deep abiding friendship because of the Lord Jesus and their desire for the good and for virtue. So at least this is kind of my mission down at the school.
That's awesome. And even circling back to like the 5 principles, it seems that like that which is natural to us, what we're inclined to, is like culminates in those friendships. So, we desiring what is good. Well, you experience what is good about a person, and you're reminded what is good about you in a friendship. What is true? A good friend is going to be honest with you. Well, not necessarily sexual union, but in intimacy, at least, between friends.
Even there, though, like the fullest sexual union, right? Like you need to be friends with your spouse. Like there needs to be the friendship of the good, not just friendship of pleasure. Like, that's why I tell the boys, like, and they get scandalized by this. I'll be like, boys, do you think if you get married one day, or do you want to get married one day? Yeah. Do you think if you like find another woman attractive, or even like your heart falls in love with another woman, like that's bad or a bad sign that you're not? They're like, yeah, that should never happen. And I'm like, listen, the point of marriage is like you're committed to this deep friendship with this woman, right? Anyway, so just to affirm what you're saying as well, it's all about that virtue in all these aspects of our life.
Well, thank you. Yeah, appreciate it. And just like simply, because I know that's where you're kind of talking about like how this natural law helps us understand the human heart. That particularly when we're faced with either debates or people who have different opinions of us, I think it's really, one, remembering these principles for ourselves in order to kind of engage them properly, but also to remember that somehow, somewhere, those principles are still in their heart. But maybe they've been skewed, they don't understand them, or no one has helped them to realize them or draw them out of themselves. And that can be just the invitation. Instead of like proving you that you're wrong or let me prove to you that I'm right, it was rather like let's get to the heart here, what is innately good about you, what is already there, and get you to these principles or these understandings, and then let the person be intelligent, like to figuring things out themselves instead of just let me tell you why you're right or wrong.
Yeah, and ultimately what I'll teach the boy, because the whole course is supposed to, like in the description, is like the Socratic method. So I'll teach them the story of Socrates, who would go around basically he would ask like craftsman questions, and he'd be like, hey, is there like a best way to make a table? And like the table maker would be like, yes, like it's, there's certain principles that you need to have, which is this, this, and this. And he'd say, okay, is there a best way to live life? And he would transition it there just to kind of show that we do understand innately that there's kind of best ways to do certain things. And yet when it comes to senses of morality or senses of like our own living, we kind of say, well, to each his own. Well, at some level, like, yeah, you like this hobby or this sport, fine. But when it comes to seeking the truth or wanting the good or you know. Anyway, we get into all the controversial topics in the second semester, and I see if the boys remember all the principles to see what we can do. A lot of times it works pretty good too.
Yeah.
So.
And for, I mean, a lot of people, remembering tons of different things isn't going to necessarily help them. But if they have just 5 core things that they can then, you know, use as their basis to, you know, argue or debate or whatever, that's what's helpful. Because, you know, we've been in years of philosophy and learn all of these things. Well, most people don't have that opportunity all of that time. Rather, just something really basic. And that's kind of been somewhat the goal of this podcast or things in general, is just like give people starters or tools to just start thinking themselves, and then be able to use that, you know, in whatever situation they find themselves in.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, maybe some, as a last thing, just some resources that are, you know, kind of helpful. I mean, one, you know, I'm a millennial, so I refresh all my philosophy before class on YouTube, or I show a lot of YouTube to them. But there's certain things like the Dominicans have what is it, Aquinas 101 videos, which are really helpful. There's a book that I just ordered that I like to reference a little bit for my class. I think it's by Daniel Sullivan, called An Introduction to Philosophy. Kind of a good like Catholic distillation, because when you talk about philosophy, we could be talking about a lot of different things. You know, we can get into like modern philosophy or postmodern, but I'd stick to kind of the classics and, you know, the ancients. But then even like basic Christian levels, so like reading Mere Christianity,
Sure,
things like this. So yeah, I think just like asking these deep questions not just helps you grow intellectually so you can debate, but actually helps you become who you're desiring to be.
And just to bring it full circle, having friends who you can discuss these things with.
Yeah.
And not necessarily like trying to, you know, come to conclusions, but just being able to like, hey, bro, like, have you ever thought about this? I was like, a true friend of virtue is going to be able to sit there and you quote unquote waste time or are bored in a, you know, on the world standards, maybe just trying to like wonder, you know, is there something better out there? Or is there a better thing in my life? Or is that really true for me? Because if it is, then I need to start living life differently. Having those kind of friends also, and it's a perfect cycle, right? Living this way will hopefully dispose you to having good and virtuous friends, and having good and virtuous friends deepens your capacity to want to know and practice these things.
Yeah, and even the art of conversation, like it's a hard thing to figure out how to do that. You know, even with your friends, where it's like, oh, this is a tense thing or a vulnerable thing coming up, and like, what do I? There's even like little things that you can do there though. So like whenever I'm talking to whoever, people usually like are saying stuff and they're not clear. So all you have to do, rather than like kind of try to fumble around, is just be like, what do you mean by that? Which is like giving them permission to just say, just tell me what you want to tell me, or like why you disagree with what I'm saying, or whatever your problem is, and we can talk about that. Or you know, Jordan Peterson loves to say, takes a rule from I think it's Carl Rogers, like when you're having like a tense conversation with someone, just apply the rule, officially or unofficially, that like, all right, before I respond to what you're saying, I'm just going to repeat back to you in some way what you just said and see if you're like, yes, that's what I'm saying. Because otherwise we just start talking over and around each other. And I think the goal of really like kind of debate or even like tense conversations isn't just to win, but to discover more of the truth, right? Whether it's like, well, I'm convinced that this is the truth, I don't need to know what you think. Well, maybe you need to know like the truth of why this person's bothered by this. You know, you don't need to be convinced of like the moral argument, you're firm in that. But let me actually discover like, well, why is this a problem for you? Because if we're just talking about the issue without talking about the person, then, you know, that's usually where I find people are kind of bent out of shape, is because these things get like personal, and those need to be like kind of reverenced and received as well.
Very good. Well, appreciate you, Father, for joining us today.
You got it.
Thank you all for sticking around for another episode of All Good in the Brotherhood. Please do all of those things that the influencers tell you to do, like, subscribe, follow us on Instagram as well. And if you have any questions about principles or what is a good way to like start leaning into discovering what is true, what is good, please leave a comment, send us an email, and if there's a particular one of those hot button topics that follows upon principles that you would like us to discuss at some point in the future, please let us know. So.
And if there's any Catholic philosophers that are listening that if I said anything incorrect, please correct me in the comments. Anyway, I'm always humble enough to know that I don't know everything. So there you go.
Very good. Well, thank you again, Father Barnabas, and thank you all. Have a wonderful day.